Good morning. You can be opening your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and we're going to be looking at a text in that chapter in just a few moments. That song that we just sang, Let Me Live Close to Thee Each Day, is a perfect song for what we're going to be looking at this morning. That God has put us in this world that is passing away and expects us to draw closer and closer to Him as that time gets closer. Our physical circumstances do not ultimately matter. Whatever it is that you're physically going through would certainly feel like a big thing to you. But there's another sense in which those things don't ultimately matter. And this truth is something that humbles the proud and rejoices the humble. This is a truth that our advertisements doesn't want us to believe. It's a truth that our culture wants us to forget. And it's a truth that we sometimes want to forget as well. There's a text here in 1 Corinthians chapter 7 that teaches us this valuable truth. And the way that it does it is unlike any other passage that I know of in Scripture. For us to orient ourselves to what Paul is doing here in this text, I want to point out that the Corinthian church was going through lots of different problems. The first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians, the church is dealing with divisions over their favorite teachers, where it's not just a preference, but it's actually dividing. They're also engaged in sexual sin and suing each other, and really that just taking advantage of other people and trying to take whatever you can from other people. In chapters 12 through 14, part of this was from the scripture reading that Paul did for us. They were boasting over their different spiritual gifts. If you were a tongue speaker in Corinth, then you were especially one of the coolest people at that church. And everybody was just excited for the tongue speaker to get up and start speaking in some other language so somebody could interpret or maybe not interpret it. This is just a sampling of some of the issues that the Corinthian church is going through. You know, you could outline the whole book and show the different things that Paul is responding to based on reports he's heard about them and based on questions that they've sent him. But one of the things that you see happening in this letter is that Paul will be addressing whatever the problem is, and then it seems like he does this thing that's not really related to the topic, almost like it's some kind of an excursion. So in the first 4 chapters, actually, let me say this first. What is it that all of these things share in common with each other, these issues? One thing that they share in common is that these are all new convert issues. Like, none of these people are asking questions about the visions in the book of Daniel. None of them are asking deep questions about the Lord's second coming. None of them are asking deep questions about what it is that the Lord expects from them in ways that would be deeper than what they're dealing with here. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, this church is more of an infant kind of church. They hadn't been Christians for super long. But these issues are new convert kinds of issues. Something else that they have in common is that all of these issues have a concern with earthly circumstances or status. You know, they want to align themselves with Paul. They want to align themselves with Apollos. And we're concerned about how people view us. They're concerned about sexual issues and suing people and being able to extract from others what they can. They're concerned about being able to have positions over people with the gifts and the talents and abilities that they have. This church is very earthly minded. And this gets to the thing that I was about to say. All of these issues have deeper principles behind them. And this is where Paul will go on to these excursions or these asides that you kind of wonder, how does it relate to the thing he's dealing with? So in the first 4 chapters when he deals with divisions, how does this relate to this little aside that he gives about God's mind getting into our minds? It's this deep thought that he gives about how God's mind is transmitted through the apostles to us. What does that have to do with the divisions? Or when he deals with sexual sin and using other people, he gives these asides or these deep truths about Jesus being our Passover lamb and how we're going to judge angels. What does that have to do with sexual sin and using other people? Or when he talks about boasting over spiritual gifts, it's in that context that he gives the famous love chapter. What does that have to do with this division that they're having over their spiritual gifts? What Paul does in all of these instances, and there's more examples of this throughout the book, is he deals with this surface problem. And then he goes to the deeper principle that if you understood that principle, this surface problem would be taken care of, and many of your other problems would be taken care of as well. This is what chapter 7 is like as well. In chapter 7, this is one of those sticky chapters on marriage and divorce and how to deal with marriage problems. And in the middle of this chapter, Paul gives one of these asides or these excursions where if you understood what he meant in this text, then a lot of your marriage problems would be solved, and not just your marriage problems, but lots of other problems. And so I would suggest that in these little excursions or these asides that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians, if you really understood these deeper principles, even if the certain circumstances that the church is going through don't apply to you, these deeper principles do in many different scenarios. And so I want us to look at what Paul says in chapter 7. Some of the text we're going to read will deal with marriage. That's not really going to be the focus of this lesson, though. I want us to see the deeper principle that he teaches here about this present form of the world passing away. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, starting in verse 17. Only let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned to him and to which God has called him. This is my rule in all the churches. Was anyone at that time of his call already circumcised? Let him not seek to remove the marks of circumcision. Was anyone at the time of his call uncircumcised? Let him not seek circumcision. For neither circumcision counts for anything nor uncircumcision, but keeping the commands of God. Each one should remain in the condition in which he was called. Were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. But if you can gain your freedom, avail yourself of that opportunity. For he who is called in the Lord as a bondservant is a freedman of the Lord. Likewise, he who is free when called is a bondservant of Christ. You were bought with a price. Do not become bondservants of men. So, brothers, in whatever condition each was called, let him remain with God. Now, concerning the betrothed, I have no command from the Lord, but I give my judgment as the one by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek a wife. But if you do marry, you have not sinned, and if a betrothed woman marries, she has not sinned. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you of that. This is what I mean, brothers. The appointed time is grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and as those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. For the present form of this world is passing away. I want you to be free from anxieties. There's a lot of things going on in this passage. And I want us to think about what this passage is saying under these three headings. Number one, when is it that we live? When do we live? Number two, why do we live? And number three, how is it that we're supposed to live? Let's start with this first point. When is it that we live? And you might think about that, well, when we're with the Lord forever. But what I mean by that is something different here. We live in an era of Christianity awaiting final judgment. This is the last era of mankind until the new heavens and the new earth and everything's going to be the way that it's going to be forever. And in this period of time that we live, this is when we live, how is it that Paul describes this era or this time? In verse 26, Paul says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is good for a person to remain as he is. In the context, he's talking about single people remaining single so that they would be spared of earthly problems. What does he mean in this text by saying that we live in an era that has present distress? Well, there's a couple different ways that people have looked at this. Some people have suggested that this is talking about the persecution that was going to happen about 10 years later under Emperor Nero. where he was going to badly mistreat Christians. And it could be that Paul is saying, hey, because of these things that are going to be happening soon, it would be better to not even be married to somebody because you're going to have less things to worry about. Maybe that's what he's talking about. Maybe he's talking about local Corinthian distresses. Maybe there was famines in the city of Corinth. Maybe there was some kind of political upheaval or something in this town. And he's saying that in light of what's going to happen or what is happening to you now, it may not be better to marry at the moment. Okay, maybe that's what he's dealing with. Do you think it's possible, though, that Paul might be explaining what would be true for every generation in every era? Paul would say this in 2 Corinthians 3:12, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." Even if you want to say that Paul is dealing with specific seasons in the city of Corinth, wouldn't it be true throughout world history in every generation that there was going to be present distresses, especially for those who sought to please the Lord, that these people were going to suffer persecution? So one of the things that you could say about the era in which we live is that it will have present distresses from time to time. There's going to be things that are very difficult. Every 40 years or so, there's especially going to be times that people will say historically have had war and famine and difficulties. You realize that we live in a time that's not always peaceful and stable. We know that. So there's another thing, though, that Paul says about the time in which we live in this text, and that's in verse 29, and he starts to intensify this a little bit. In verse 29, Paul says, "This is what I mean, brothers, the appointed time has grown very short." And again, some people have argued that Paul is dealing in this text with some kind of judgment that's going to happen to the city of Corinth, or some kind of really traumatic thing that's going to happen to them. Even if that's the case, Paul would use similar language in other places to talk about this final era we live in before Jesus returns. Now, when he says the appointed time, there's two Greek words for time. One Greek word for time is chronos time, and that's like the ticking of a clock. If somebody asks you how old you are, and you say, well, I'm 300 years old, that's how many hours and days and everything have passed on the clock. That's not the term that he uses here when he says the appointed time has grown short. He uses the other Greek word, which is kairos. And kairos time means this: it's a season, an opportune time. It is not merely as a succession of minutes, but a period of opportunity. All right, try to imagine this for a moment. Imagine that you have graduated college, and you finally landed the job interview. And the job interview is going to be 30 minutes. Are those 30 minutes as critical as the 30 minutes that you spend afterwards scrolling on social media? Those 30 minutes of the job interview, even though it's the same 30 minutes as your social media time, the 30 minutes of the job interview is kairos time. It's an opportunity. Those 30 minutes are critical, and they're going to affect the way that you might live the rest of your life. Maybe another way that you could think about this is with a basketball game. During a basketball game, there's a lot of times where 5 seconds will tick off the clock, chronos time. But imagine that your team is down by 2 points, and there's 5 seconds left in the game. Those 5 seconds have become kairos time. This is a season. This is an opportunity that if we don't make the best of these 5 seconds, then it's going to affect the way that the rest of our season might be played out. It's going to affect maybe whether some of us might go to the NBA or whatever, if it's a college game, that sort of thing. What Paul is saying here is that our whole life on earth is kairos time. It's an opportune time. It's a season where if you don't make the most of it and the best of it, it's going to affect where you're going to be forever. And he says that this opportune time, this opportunity in this verse is shortened. That Greek word means to be drawn together. Sometimes it's used to refer to taking a corpse and wrapping it together so that like the arms and the legs and everything are in so you can carry it easier, that sort of thing. The CSB says that the time is limited. Our life on earth is not our sum existence. But the life that we have on this earth, do you look at it as the ticking of time, or do you look at every day and every moment as kairos time? It's critical what I do with my time right now. Well, why would that be the case? You know, we got distress. This is also a time of opportunity. But look what he says in verse 31. The present form of this world is passing away. You look at how the world works, the rules by which the world operates, and Paul is saying that there's going to come a time where the way that this world works is going to be completely different. Now, again, is Paul referring to the distresses of the city of Corinth and how there's going to be things that really change the politics of the day? Or is he thinking bigger picture? Either way you look at it, it would be true in both scenarios. But think about just even literally changing seasons. When it's winter, do we operate by different rules? This is when you have to get your jackets and your mittens and your toboggans. You guys call them toboggans here, the hats? Yeah. The toboggans were like sleds in Minnesota, but we know more about snow there. But whatever, we can take that one. When it's winter, you have your heat on. You operate by different rules. Your gas bill is going to be higher than your electrical bill. Some of you guys can remember the days before the internet. And now that we have the internet, it's like the rules are different in how we live. You could think about it like this. Let's say that you become a master of how this world works. You understand psychology. You've read the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People. You know how to kind of get your way and make people do the things that you want them to do. And you become a master of the world. And Paul would say, you're going to be outdated pretty quickly. Because this world in the present form that we live in is vanishing away. And there's going to be new rules in place one day. We live in an era where there's distress, but it's a critical period of time where, like the last 5 seconds of a basketball game, the buzzer's about to go off. Do you see how serious this time is that you live in? Because this present world is passing away. So, in light of all of that, Paul tells us why we should be living. What is it that we live for? If I'm living to get all the things of this world and to accumulate the biggest bank account and have the biggest influence and have all the people following me on social media and having all these, you realize that that's not really the purpose of life because that's going to be outdated soon. Paul says that the reason for living is to serve Jesus. In verses 22 and 23, we are bondservants of Christ. You were bought with a price. This is the second time Paul says in 1 Corinthians, you were bought with a price. You realize that you don't even belong to yourself? You know, people talk about my body and my car and my house and my this. You don't even belong to yourself if you're a Christian. The Lord owns you. And you're a slave of the Lord, which means that you do whatever it is that He's asked you to do. He says in verse 19, what matters is keeping the commandments of the Lord. Now ask yourself, in this world that has distress, but also is an opportune time, and it's going to dictate the rest of your existence, and the present form is passing away, are you sober-minded enough to realize that if all this stuff is passing away, the only thing that matters is to serve Jesus? You know, sometimes people have looked at people that are Christians and gone, why are you following a 2,000-year-old book? You guys are sure outdated. But how about this? How about we look at it like this? If we're following the Lord, who is going to make the present form of this world pass away, that means that we're getting our instructions from the one that's going to dictate what the future looks like. Christians are not outdated. We're ahead of our time. If we're submitting to the Lord that's going to refashion our existence in exactly the way that it ought to be, and we're following Him, we're not outdated. We're the ones that are from the future in a sense. Paul says that the reason we live in this opportune time is to serve Jesus, and this is despite whatever your circumstances are. How many times do people use their circumstances as a reason why I'm not taking this opportune time to serve the Lord? But instead, I'm trying to get all I can in this present world that's going to be passing away. You notice how this text, how it says this in verse 24, in whatever condition each was called, there let him remain with God. In verse 17, let each person lead the life that the Lord has assigned. Now, some people have used this taken this out of context to talk about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. It doesn't matter if you're in an unscriptural marriage, remain in your calling. That's not what he means in this context. If you were living in sin and God called you out of darkness, you stay out of the darkness. But Paul is still saying something here that's important, that I like what Leon Morris says about this. Becoming a Christian means bringing what one is into the service of God. Circumcision, uncircumcision, slavery, freedom, or whatever. Each has its own importance in the service of God. The slave, for example, can show how the believer can serve God under the limits imposed by slavery, as the free man cannot. Well, the free man can show how to submit himself to voluntary service to God. Paul's point is that one can serve God in a variety of places. It is not necessary to leave one's station in life simply because one is converted. All right. In the context, what would be the situations in life that my mission in life, despite the present distress, when I'm thinking about the opportune time that I have, if my fixation is on serving the Lord, what would that mean practically? Well, in the context, you can go back to verse 12 in this chapter and see that Paul, in the immediate context, is dealing with somebody married to an unbeliever. Have you ever known somebody married to an unbeliever and they let that cause them to fall away? I would suggest that that's somebody who doesn't understand that this life has present distress, but at the same time that this life is an opportune season to make the right choices, and that the present form of this world is passing away. Have you ever seen somebody who was married to an unbeliever but was a very, very godly person? That's somebody who can see and transcend the circumstance and know that this is not all there is to life. And because I know that there's more to life, I'm going to keep living for the one that's going to fashion the world into what it ought to be, and I'm going to serve him while I can. It doesn't matter what your marriage circumstance is. It doesn't change your purpose in life. What about circumcision? You notice that in verse 19 he says, circumcision counts for nor circumcision counts for anything, nor uncircumcision. He's saying here that circumcision nor uncircumcision do not matter. Now, that might not feel very relatable to us today, but in this culture, whether you were circumcised or not had a lot to do with your social standing. And if you could fit into certain circles and be accepted by certain people. What are the things that people use today as status symbols? Oh, you got that kind of purse. You got that color of skin. You've got that kind of education. You've got that kind of wealth. You've got those kinds of logos on your jackets, and everybody can know how much money you got, and blah, blah, blah. And Paul would say that things that are status markers, they don't matter. If you really understand that this world is an opportune moment, the buzzer's about to go off, and this present form is passing away, you wouldn't care about that stuff. Now notice what else he says, though. We live and serve God even if we were slaves. Now, I got to, verse 21, to me is one of the most shocking verses in 1 Corinthians, where he says, were you a bondservant when called? Do not be concerned about it. How offensive is that? Paul, you don't understand what you're saying here. When you became a Christian, were you a slave? And then Paul has the audacity to say, don't be concerned about it. What? Now, he does say in verse 21, if you can avail yourself the opportunity to be free, that would obviously be the better thing. But what Paul is saying here is that your job scenario. Are you waiting for a perfect job? Are you waiting for a better boss? For you to get your attitude right? For you to be the person that God has asked you to be? Do you not realize that the reason you live in this opportune moment of your life is to serve God, and whether you're married to an unbeliever or you're not married, or you're married to a great person, it doesn't ultimately matter. Whether you have good status markers or not, it doesn't matter. Whether you've got a good boss or a bad boss, it ultimately doesn't matter. I've heard people talk about trying to discern what's God's will for my life. Should I go to this college? Should I get that degree? Should I marry this person? Should I marry that person? And people have this idea, it seems, when they talk like this, that God's will for my life is getting myself in the right circumstances. And then this text comes along and says, your circumstances don't matter. You can live in the will of God by concerning yourself with what He's commanded you to do. Now, do you think Paul understands that there's times to weep and there's times to mourn? He's not saying that your physical circumstances don't have real impact on you, but he's saying from a big perspective of the history of the world, these things ultimately don't matter. So, the question then could be asked, how is it that we live in light of these things? If we were going to tease out some applications from this text in what Paul is saying here about time, what would we say about it? Just to set this up, let me say one thing. You guys realize that the way that you know what you truly believe is not what you say you believe, but it probably has more to do with your emotional reactions to things. Your knee-jerk emotional reactions teach you and show you what your deep beliefs are, and those are the moments where you really let your face be shown. Because those are the moments where it's harder to keep the mask on. Imagine that you're at a restaurant and the waiter comes and they don't give you the food exactly like you want it, and your emotional reaction is, this is a great injustice. You might say that you believe in the importance of love and forbearing and being patient with people, but in that moment it was shown that what you really believed was, I deserve to be treated like a king. That's really what you believe. You can say all you want about whatever. How do you know if you really believe that this present form of the world is passing away? How do you know if you really believe it? One thing would be if you feel superior based on the kinds of things that Paul talks about. Do you have the feeling of being puffed up about any of the kinds of things he lists out here? And what are some of the things that he mentions? Look at verse 29. Let those who have wives live as though they had none. All right, Samantha, you're on your own. I don't think that's the point of this. I think the point of this passage is you got a wife, and all throughout 1 Corinthians 7, it's about marriage and marriage problems and all this sort of thing, and you're married, and he says, live as though you had no wife. The idea is not that you're supposed to negate your responsibilities, but don't make your marriage the biggest thing in your life. Obviously, fulfill what God has said about it, but do you ever feel superior to other people because you're married and because you got kids and you seem further along? You think that gives you the right to boast over other people? You don't understand that the present world is passing away. You don't get it. What about another one? In verse 30, those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing. You're waiting for that next thing in your life to really cause you to rejoice. And if I could have that, or I could have more of those things, or I could collect more of this, then that's going to make me really happy, and that's going to send me to the moon, or whatever it is that people say. Are you the kind of person that has all kinds of rejoicing, not in spiritual things, but in earthly things? Don't think about it as that big of a deal. Have your little day. You got your new car, cool, that's good for you. Don't think it's the biggest thing in the world. What about buying and dealing? People that are movers and shakers of society in verses 30 and 31, and those who buy as though they had no goods, let those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it. There are people who can make a lot of things happen, and they're powerful people. And then Jesus says this in Luke 12:20, but God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? Are you really proud of all the power that you have, and you're a mover and shaker in your industry and in the things that you do? Are you really proud of that? Big deal. It's not going to last forever. And of course, you can do the inverse of all of this. Do you feel inferior to people who've got family and spouses when you don't have those things? When you see other people with earthly causes to rejoice, are you the one mourning? When you see other people that can buy and deal and do all these impressive things, do you start to feel really inferior to them? If you do, it shows that you don't really believe what this text is saying. Maybe that would be one application with this. Here's another application. Do you live life with eternal urgency? Our mission in life is not to stop the world from global warming. Our mission in life is not whatever our favorite politics are, and we really want this guy to win or that person to win or something like that. That's not the things that we're supposed to be urgent about. If we understand that this present world is passing away and the world that we live in is the buzzer's about to go off, do you look at every moment as an opportunity for something good? Parents with your kids. The conversations that you have, the meals that you have together, are you intentionally having important conversations? What about in the relationships that we have with one another? Are we talking about things more than just sports? Not that it's wrong to talk about these kinds of things, but are we confessing our sins to one another? Are we making the best use of the opportunities that we have with one another? What about in preparing for 10 years from now? What are you doing to become an elder? Every day is an opportunity. The buzzer's going to go off. That's how serious every moment is. What about in your own character growth? Do you look at every day and every opportunity as chances to grow more in your holiness? Every time somebody mistreats you as an opportunity to examine your heart and go, how can I live more in line with what Jesus expects me to be? Now, none of this is to say that recreation and vacations and stuff are wrong. The book of Ecclesiastes would show those kinds of ideas. But even in those recreational moments, do you see them as ways to intentionally refuel to make the most of the opportunities that you have? Paul ends this text in verse 32 by saying, I want you to be free from anxieties. If I really believed what this text was saying, I would not be so concerned about having the newest, nicest, whatever. I wouldn't be boastful if I felt like I had the best marriage in the world. I would be somebody who, yes, can appreciate the blessings of God. I'm not saying that those things are nothing. I'm saying that the person that really understands these things knows that there's something that transcends all of this, and it puts all of it in perspective. We live in an era of time filled with distress that will not last forever. And God has given us this opportune time to prepare for the new era that's coming. Do you feel superior? Do you feel inferior to other people? Do you have the kind of urgency that you ought to have? Do you see how Paul, when he brings this stuff up in chapter 7, and he's dealing with marriages, but then he surfaces and talks about these deeper principles? Do you see how that would help any marriage? But it wouldn't just help any marriage. It would help you in whatever circumstance you might be in. Are you living with eternity in mind? We're about to sing a song that's meant to encourage us. We're going to sing the song, Burdens Are Lifted at Calvary. One of the things that Calvary teaches us, again, is that this present form is passing away, and God is going to remake everything new one day. Store your treasures up in heaven. If there's anything that we can do for you, this is an opportunity to talk to somebody before you leave, or come forward while we stand and while we sing.